Hi, we're going to talk about the Appalachian Mountain regions today. Okay, the Appalachian Mountain regions looks like this, and as you can see, it is a very hilly area with a whole bunch of trees. Let's first talk about the climate of the Appalachian Mountains. The climate of the North Appalachian Mountains. The climate of the Northern Appalachian was temperate, which means it had cold winters and hot summers. The mountain forests had snow in winter and plenty of rain, so that crops could be grown without irrigation. The growing season was not as long as in the Southwest, but was long enough to grow corn, beans, and squash. When we look at the geography of the Northern Appalachian Plains, the Northern Appalachian Mountains were not very high. The mountains were older and were more worn down by erosion than any other mountain range in North America. There were many valleys, little streams, and rivers. The soil was fertile, and most of the land was covered with forest. The geography of the area was hilly. The natural resources of the Northern Appalachian Mountains. The Northern Appalachian Mountains had a great variety of natural resources. There were plenty of trees, so wood was available as a building material. There was a great variety of game in the region, such as deer, bear, elk, and moose. There were also plenty of smaller game animals, such as turkey, porcupines, beaver, mink, and foxes. There were fish in the streams and birds, such as quail and pigeons. There were many nut trees in the forests of the region, including chestnuts, acorns, hickory nuts, and walnuts. There were many other kinds of edible plant foods available, including maple sap for sugar, many kinds of fruit, and roots and leaves of other plants. In summary, the environment of the Northern Appalachian Mountains provided a great variety and abundance of natural resources. We are going to talk about the Mohawk tribe who lived in the Northern Appalachian Mountains. The Mohawk tribe was one of the many tribes of Native Americans who lived in the forests of the Northern Appalachian Mountains. The Mohawk and the other tribes of this region had a similar culture because they all lived in a similar environment. The Mohawk, along with four neighboring tribes, the Cayuga, the Oneida, the Onondaga, and the Seneca, formed a confederation. A confederation consists of several different tribes or nations that agree to meet regularly to reach important decisions. These 5 tribes were called the Iroquois Confederacy. The Mohawk had a similar problem to other Native American tribes that we've learned about. They needed to figure out how to find food, clothing, and shelter. This was an economic problem. The Mohawk and the need for food. The Mohawk had been farming for hundreds of years and raised crops of corn, squash, and pumpkins, and beans. Farming was an important source of food for many Native American tribes, including the Mohawk. However, farming was not the only source of food for the Mohawk. The men also hunted for food. In the mountainous regions of the Appalachians, the forests were home to a great deal of game. The Mohawk hunted deer, bear, elk, and moose, as well as smaller animals such as turkeys, porcupines, and foxes. In spring, the men would fish and hunt birds. The third source of food for the Mohawk was food from wild plants and trees. For example, the Mohawk would gather nuts for chestnuts and walnut trees. The Mohawk met their need for food equally by hunting, fishing, and farming and gathering. The Mohawk and the problem for clothing. The Mohawk made their clothing mainly from deer skin, which had been treated with animal brains to make it softer and more flexible than most leather. The men wore moccasins and kilts and shirts, which were fringed and decorated with porcupine quills. The women wore moccasins and deerskin dresses decorated with fringe and porcupine quills. The Mohawk and the need for shelter. The most plentiful natural resource of the Mohawk were the trees in the forests around them. So they built their houses out of tree trunks, branches, and bark. The Mohawk built long houses. The typical long house was about 18 feet wide and from 60 to 100 feet long. That's 3 of these classrooms in a row. Several related families would share a long house. Longhouses were gathered together in villages of 300 to 600 people. The Mohawk villages were surrounded by wooden posts set in the earth that made a solid stockade wall around the whole village, enclosing from 5 to 10 acres. The fences were designed to keep out raiding parties from other tribes. Outside the fences, there were hundreds of acres of cultivated fields, for crops from these fields supported the village. The effect of the Mohawk solution's basic needs. As with other Native American cultures, the effect of the solutions they chose was to keep them in balance with their environment. Their needs were met in ways that had worked for thousands of years. However, one important effect of their choice of solutions was that it required that they move their villages every 10 years or so. After 10 years, the nearby farmland was no longer very productive. The firewood would get scarce, and the longhouses would start to decay. Then the whole village would move to a new location and build a new wooden town.